Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Kuhn. I'm the pastor at the Shelbina United Methodist Church, and this is one of the places I share the sermons that are written every week for those who are gathering for worship. I realize I should probably introduce myself on occasion to people who are tuning into this, and as well as saying I am always appreciative of people who watch the videos, these videos. I can see the numbers of the people who engage, and that's just, it's an honor. I admit, it just blows me away that people like watch these videos that I'm putting out. Also, I hope that in addition to these videos, you're able to be part of a worshiping community somewhere, because following Jesus, it's a group activity, and it's just something we do together. I mean, we can't even pray alone, because the way Jesus taught us to pray is our Father. We are meant to be together in this. So, that being said, the only real announcement I have, I guess, is that Easter is coming, and I hope you have a place to worship, celebrate the resurrection. You are always welcome here Sundays at 10. Anyone here struggle with listening to the news? Well, anyone here, I'm in this room by myself, but like I was pondering that, like I know I struggle to listen to the news. After 2 years of pandemic, the news was, right? And I had started listening to a lot of history podcasts. I listened to history of China, the history of Afghanistan, history of the Middle East. It's not any more uplifting, but at least it's old and depressing, I guess. And I was thinking, you know what? We're coming out of this pandemic. We're getting through it. Finally. And I can start watching the news a little bit more now. And then Ukraine happened. And that was depressing. Now listening to the news is once more an exercise in how much can I listen before it just gets to be a drag and be a problem. And listening to people sort of struggle and debate with how to handle Ukraine, what should this country be doing in the face of the naked aggression of Russia, the unprovoked attack, the lies that are being told? Russia is arguing that it is trying to denazify a country that happens to be led by a democratically elected Jewish man. Like, it just doesn't work. It's just doesn't make sense. And so we're having these discussions about how do we aid Ukraine? Should we aid Ukraine? Do we send supplies? What type of supplies? Does Ukraine join NATO or the EU? Do we create no-fly zones? That's the real hot button right now, is do we create no-fly zones? Because as soon as you do that, there will be conflict between American or European, NATO, and Russian forces, and that could escalate quickly. However, Russia has this nasty habit of creating ways to get out of corridors to leave cities under siege and then dropping artillery shells on those corridors. So this is a challenge. There is no way to sugarcoat this. This is evil. This is just wrong. Listening to people discuss this, I had a sense of deja vu. I've been in these discussions before. And the last time that like people were really percolating about this and some like a new situation had arisen that led to this was back in 2002. If you remember 2002, that was happening at the time when we as a nation were in the midst of responding to the tragedy of 9/11. And there was this drive to do something. Afghanistan, are we going to go to Afghanistan? Iraq it wasn't on the horizon, but it was just kind of over the horizon for those who had eyes to see and were looking at what was unfolding. And there was a lot of discussion about how do we handle the use of military, how do we respond to violence, when do we use armed forces, and that, sadly enough, that conversation never really completely stopped because it's been a rough 20 years when it comes to, I mean, it's 20 years ago now. It's been a rough 20 years in some ways. Afghanistan, which just finally wrapped up this year, studying the history of Afghanistan, no one in 2,300 years has entered Afghanistan and not left Afghanistan without getting kicked around a bit on the way out. Like that's We entered Afghanistan 20 years ago, and man, it's been ugly. And now we've left Afghanistan. Iraq, I mean, that was its own particular flavor of hard. Russia invaded Crimea in those 20 years. Africa and Darfur, and now we have Russia invading the whole of Ukraine, not just the eastern parts of Ukraine. And so I think it continues to be important for us to pay attention to how do we think about the use of violence, the use of force, the use of armed forces. Specifically, how do we think about that as people who follow the Prince of Peace? Like, that's our gig. Christians follow Jesus, the Prince of Peace, and how do we think about, how do we get involved in this? I mean, especially in the abstract, it might sound clean and simple, but like, people are dying in Ukraine, and how do we respond? Okay, here's the plan. This is what we're going to do to start thinking through this. This week, I'm going to give you a full-throated defense of what's called just war theory. It is the mental construct, the philosophical, like, here is how we think about, as a Christian, this is how you use armed forces. And I'm going to argue that to the best of my ability. And then next week, I'm going to present to you the argument for pacifism, that Jesus said, put down the sword, and that's that to be Christian is to put down the sword and never pick it up. These are the two options that we as Christians have for how we think about the use of armed forces. There are other ways that armed forces are used. Like, you can think of the police. But the police use violence and use force. But that's a different thing, because the police use the minimal amount of force necessary to maintain civil order. That at least is the theory of it, right? Whether it always happens, that's a whole different discussion. But in theory, police is not the maximal amount of force applied in a military situation. It's the minimal amount of force applied to maintain civil order. And that's not what we're going to look at. The other extreme is crusade. In a crusade understanding of the use of military force, crusade is like, we're right, completely right, and they're completely wrong, and it leads to this stance of like, anything we do to them is okay because they're completely wrong and we're fighting on God's side. And yeah, that dog don't hunt. I mean, that's just the long and short of it. Like, that is not a coherent way of thinking about how to use armed forces for, as Paul tells us, all have fallen short of the glory of God, and there is no we're good and they're bad, and that's that. I mean, there's always a mix. These things are always complicated. And as we're seeing in Ukraine, this Russian invasion, the Russian propaganda towards the soldiers who are invading, they believe they are denazifying Ukraine and that they are rescuing people who don't want to be in Ukraine, even though Ukrainians, it's a democratic country that has been coming out of and heading towards having a stable democratic situation. And a lot of this was the spark that sort of has driven this is Ukraine's turning to the West. And so now we have Russian forces invading, and they believe that they are doing the right thing. And so, like, this isn't a crusade. It can't be a crusade, because life is more complicated than I'm good, you're evil, and now I can do whatever I want to you. Like, that doesn't work. So we're not going to talk about police. Because that's a different topic. We're not going to talk about crusade because it's incoherent. Today is just war. Next Sunday, we're going to talk about pacifism. So that's, and that lines up with the Methodist understanding of how we think about war. Let me read. This is the paragraph in the social principles. The social principles, this is what we're aspiring to as Methodists. This is its paragraph 164, if you want to look it up. 164, paragraph I. We deplore war and urge the peaceful settlement of all disputes among nations. From the beginning, the Christian conscience has struggled with the harsh realities of violence and war, for these evils clearly frustrate God's loving purposes for humankind. We yearn for the day when there will be no more war and people will live together in peace and justice. Some of us believe that war and other acts of violence are never acceptable to Christians. We also acknowledge that many Christians believe that when peaceful alternatives have failed, the force of arms may regretfully be preferable to unchecked aggression, tyranny, and genocide. We honor the witness of the pacifists who will not allow us to become complacent about war and violence. We also respect those who support the use of force, but only in extreme situations and only when the need is clear beyond reasonable doubt and through appropriate internal organizations. We urge the establishment of the rule of law in international affairs as a means of elimination of war, violence, and coercion in these affairs. That's the official Methodist stance. And I support it. I agree with it. You can hear the two positions that I'm going to argue for this Sunday and next clearly laid out in that. So let's talk about war. Let's talk about how to be involved in war as a follower of God. War was part of the experience of Israel in the Old Testament such that there were laws. There was Torah about how to go to war. There was guidance there. In Gideon, a guy in the book of Judges, one of the judges of Judges, went to war with 300 soldiers. He had brought over 30,000, and God told him that's too many. Send home anyone who's afraid. And so he sent home, and thousands went home. And he said, this is still too many. And they went down to the water. And he says, watch everyone who drinks, how they get a drink. And anyone who drinks with their hands, send home. Only those who lean their head over and lap the water out of the river like a dog would, that's who you keep. And that is, as you might expect, kind of rare to see people do that. And so he ended up with an army, a force of 300 people. And that's who he took to war. And so there's this lesson that is taught early on in the Old Testament that you are not going to trust and depend upon the military might that you have. You need to trust God, because your military might is not what makes you God's people. Later on, King David does a census to figure out his military might. That's why you made a census, right? So you could figure out two reasons to do a census in ancient times: taxes, and to be able to know how many soldiers you can call up, or how many farmers you can call up to become soldiers. And so he was looking at soldiers as military might, and he got in trouble over that. That didn't work out very well. So that's Gideon. The lesson there is do not depend upon your military might. The second example comes from what's called the ban. In the book of Joshua, as they're conquering a couple different cities, Jericho is one of them, they are told you cannot profit from this. Whatever is in that city is God's. You cannot make money off of war. You can't profit, you can't take the livestock, you can't take all this stuff, right? And that's another part of what the teaching around war, the Torah, the law on this, is not only do you have to depend upon God, but war cannot be a money-making activity. The temptation would be too high then to go out and to make war so that you would get rich, you get land, you get territory. So this develops in the Old Testament. Less violence, more restrained over time. That's a whole sermon unto itself, just to follow that. What happens after we hear that law and we hear Jesus' command to love our enemy is that we start articulating, what is that going to look like? If we're going to love our neighbor, and our neighbor happens to be an enemy, and there are rules and laws in the Old Testament that shape how war should be fought, what does that look like? Just war is what develops in the Christian tradition. And just war is a practice that doesn't say that war is the lesser of two evils. Like there's a genocide is happening, so we go to war to prevent the genocide. That's not saying that war is less evil than a genocide. Just war theory is saying that war is good, right? We needed to go to war to prevent that genocide. That war is a good thing, right? So war can be justly fought, but you have to fight it in a just fashion. It can be done. We could go to fight for the freedom of Ukraine against the Russian invasion, and it would be good, right? Because the Russians are hurting themselves by committing this sin. They are hurting their neighbor, and for us to stop them doing this is us doing good for the Ukrainians and for the Russians, right? And the value of doing this, but it has to be done in a Christian fashion, because the risk is what we saw in Vietnam. What we saw in Vietnam is going to war, and the more I learned about what happened in Vietnam, I tracked how, and this happens in a lot of wars, it's a real problem, is that the enemy is no longer seen as neighbor, as a child of God, as fully a person. They begin to pick up nicknames, right? So the people we were fighting against in Vietnam were called by derogatory terms. And go look them up. I'm not going to repeat them. The same thing happened in World War II. Just look up derogatory terms for Germans or Vietnamese. Yeah. And when it gets to that point, right, that's when it gets off the rails. If we're fighting a war and we start calling the enemy less than human, we start treating them less than human, then we have given up all ability to fight a just war. Right? And so to make a just war possible, the Christian church has put together a set of practices, a set of assumptions, right? And this can't be a checklist, because if it's just a checklist, okay, just war now, that's not. Our ability to like weave and dodge and say, oh yeah, I've done all check, and still do what we want to, still treat people terribly, like this can't be a checklist. This has to be a defined way of life. That it's not about having a just war, it's about creating people who can be trusted with violence in the context of war. And that's hard, right? So here are the questions, here are the practices that make up this just war, to make a just warrior possible. There's a set of practices first around choosing when to go to war, and then there's a set of practices about how you act in war. So when it comes to going to war, first you have to have legitimate authority. That's the first criteria. If you're going to go to war, it can't just be me being angry about something. It has to be a legitimate authority, i.e. a state, a government of some sort. And that's not all. It can't just be the state. It has to be that the leaders of the state are people of such character that they can be trusted to make such a decision. In a democracy in which we live in, what this demands of us is that we have to be very careful about who we select as our leaders, because our leaders will be the ones who make the decision about whether to go to war or not. And there is no more consequential decision for the future of a people, because it impacts everyone so greatly. Putin's decision to go to war is impacting us. It is impacting people around the world. Like, war is a horrible, it's a disruptor. And so the first criteria is you have to have a legitimate authority being exercised by a person of good character who can be trusted to make that decision. Second, there has to be a just cause. Now, a just cause, usually we think of wars of self-defense. You know, self-defense can be, you can manipulate that however you want. The Roman Empire never went to a war that wasn't defensive. However, they were always able to manufacture a reason to defend themselves by invasion. Like that's not what this is. Just cause is, it's got to be really focused on the good of the people of that country. It has to be focused on creating more justice in that situation to build the common good, right? and so the hand-wringing that often comes up nowadays when it comes to the use of force and violence is when there are humanitarian problems in parts of the world. When there are problems and we think, man, we could go in and do something, just war does not give us any wiggle room. If there is a problem and we could go get involved and do something about it, just war demands that we do. Because if it is a just cause, we have to go. We have to do something. And if it costs us, that is what it costs to love your neighbor. So, legitimate authority, just cause. The third piece of this when to go to war, a just war, is correct intent. And this is, I mean, they kind of bury the lead on this. It's put third because in some ways it is the core of just war practices. If we're going to go to war and use violence, the intention must be towards the good of the people that we're fighting. And that's a hard thing to do, but it shapes everything else. If our intent is to love our neighbor, that shapes how we will treat people. There are certain things that we will not resort to. There are certain weapons we will not use because that's not how we would treat someone that we love, even if the person we love is our enemy. And then when the conflict has ceased, then right intention demands that we not just walk away. We have to do what we can to fix what is broken. Kind of a practical application of you broke it, you bought it, right? And that's part of the challenge of how do we understand just war right now is because in both Afghanistan and Iraq, I don't know how to think about the American assistance to Afghanistan and Iraq. They've been a fairly complicated situation in both of those. Yeah, that's a cup of coffee. We'll drink some coffee. We'll talk about that if you want. The fourth criteria, legitimate authority, just cause, right intent. The fourth criteria for going to war is last resort. Without compromising the common good, it's got to be something that people it can't be something we rush into. War is too horrific to rush into it. And that takes imagination and patience, and it's hard. The fifth criteria for going to war is a reasonable chance of success. And this might be the hardest of the criteria for going to war because it demands that we ponder whether we can pull it off. Because if we can't pull it off, then we're just increasing the suffering. And what that might lead to is situations where we have to say, the common good would demand that we go to war, but we don't think we can do it. And if we don't think we can do it and we go in, we will cause more people to die. And that is not loving our neighbors, is to cause them to die with no chance or no reasonable chance of actually pulling it off. In addition, the sort of reasonable chance of success also leads us to not declare war on nouns. Have you ever noticed that wars on nouns never, war on poverty, war on drugs, they never work. It doesn't work. So those are the criteria for going to war. The criteria for functioning while in war are discrimination. You can't kill civilians. You simply can't. And that might limit how war can be prosecuted, and it does. You cannot bomb cities. You cannot fight a war in a way that kills civilians indiscriminately. Chemical weapons, biological weapons are just out. Right? They just can't use them. And then proportionality, the last piece. You can only use the amount of force needed to achieve the desired goal, which may make for a longer war. And this proportionality in discrimination is what leads us to look at things like America dropping the atomic bomb at the end of World War II and saying that killed civilians. That was not proportionate. It shouldn't have been done. And that would have meant that more and more American soldiers would have died in the invasion of Japan, and that is what just war demands. You cannot kill civilians. You have to be proportionate. They weren't using atomic bombs. We shouldn't have either, and that would have cost us more American lives, and that is what is demanded when you go to war out of a love of neighbor. Neighbors, you can't love your neighbor and nuke their cities. It just doesn't work. And you might say, this is too hard. This demands too much. And the answer is yes, it does. 10 Commandments are too hard, but we don't say they're not true. These are just, this is what the fruit of Christians for centuries thinking through. How can we use war and violence and not damage our souls? All right, these are Now, there are some who look at these criteria, the 5 criteria for going to war, the 2 criteria for how you prosecute war, and they have come to the place of saying that in a 21st century setting, with biological, chemical, and nuclear war, weapons of mass destruction, there is no ability to wage a war, since any war that would lead to the use of weapons of mass destruction would break the requirement for a reasonable chance of success and proportionality. Like, if we go to war with Russia, Putin hits a button, and all of a sudden New York, DC, Atlanta, Chicago, San Francisco go poof in a mushroom cloud. Like, that doesn't work. And so this argument becomes what's called just peace. The idea that there is no way, under the theory of just war, that we can get involved militarily because it could so easily lead to a war that would be catastrophic, not just for one nation, but for the entire world. Whew. Depressing. So how does this shape us today? How does this impact us this afternoon? What it does, thinking through just war theory, is it presents to us the challenge of becoming people who can be trusted to handle violence. And that's not something that, you hear the phrase, you rise to the occasion. Nah, you fall onto your training. You don't rise and do something you've never done before, be better than you've ever done before. No, you fall onto the lowest common denominator. You fall back on the thing you've always been doing. That's what happens under pressure. And so for us to become people who can be trusted with figuring out, thinking through, understanding when it is that violence, the use of military force is justified, when a just war is possible, means that we need to become just ourselves. We need to be people who, just going through the criteria, who really look at who we vote for, looking at people of the gravitas, the maturity, people who will not fly off the handle, elect politicians who take the demands of war seriously. All right, that's the first step of what just war theory sort of shapes us to think about. Just war is going to be going to war out of a love of a neighbor who's desiring to kill us. And to be able to do that, first we have to practice acting for the good of others who don't like us here. Like, I can't figure out how to love other people who are trying to kill me overseas if I don't start as someone who can serve the good of people who they're not trying to kill me, they just don't like me, right? How do we love people who don't like us? Act for their good today. This means never reducing other individuals to them and using slurs and denigrating people and treating them as less than human. We can never give in to the temptation to begin personal crusades. For if we do that, we're not going to be ready or prepared to think about how do we engage in war. To prepare for a just war means that we need to get involved when there is a need. The just war gives us no wiggle room when it comes to being involved for humanitarian needs. Like, you've got to go. And if we are going to hold ourselves as a country, as a nation, up to that standard, then we need to begin by holding ourselves up to that standard, which means that when we are aware of situations in our community, we got to do what we can. Something like 1 in 3 women endure domestic abuse of some sort. 1 in 7 children each year experience some sort of abuse or neglect, according to the CDC. 1 in 3 women, that's according to the World Health Organization. And those are like 2 examples. If there's a need, we can't ignore it. It's not Midwestern nice. We can't gloss over it. We just have to go and do what we can, which might just be as simple as calling in a hotline. When we argue and fight, to learn to genuinely seek the good of others, not to fight to win, which is the temptation. I know the temptation to argue and fight to win, but to argue seeking what is good, and if that means backing down and saying the other person is right, that's got to be something we practice. Last resort demands that we actively try to make peace with the people who annoy us before writing them off. Discrimination. To have discrimination means that if I'm having an argument with someone, I have that argument with that person, and I do not let it impact how I treat their family or their friends. Proportionality. Basically, don't hold grudges, right? If someone has treated me bad a decade ago, to hold that grudge and to keep on trying to get back to them again and again and again, it can't be how we live. This is a challenge. It is. By the grace of God, by attending to the practices of following Jesus, we can become the people who can make these challenging decisions about when to go to war. The people who can decide when it is most loving and least destructive to use violence. That's what we're seeking to become. The people who are just so that we can be trusted to go to a just war. And there are indeed challenging costs to any decision we make. Right? But since we live in a world that is broken by sin, Just War argues there are going to be times when we must accept that we are going to have to use violence in return to be able to build and create something better. So that is how we think about just war in the Christian tradition. Next week, we'll talk about pacifism and some responses to this. Amen.